Sarah had always been a dreamer. Even as a little girl, she imagined herself living in a bustling city, working a job she loved, and experiencing all the adventures life had to offer. So, when she landed her first job in the city after graduating college, she was ecstatic. However, the reality of living in the city was harsher than she had imagined. The cost of living was high, and Sarah quickly realized that her meager salary wouldn't be enough to afford a place of her own. Desperate to make ends meet, she began searching for a roommate. After weeks of fruitless searching, she stumbled upon an ad for a room in an old but charming apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was affordable and the location was perfect, so she jumped at the opportunity. The apartment was everything Sarah had hoped for: spacious, cozy, and filled with character. The only downside was that she would have to share it with a roommate. But Sarah didn't mind. She had always been sociable and figured having a roommate would make her new city life more exciting. When Sarah first met Rebecca, her new roommate, she was relieved. Rebecca seemed perfect, polite, quiet, and tidy. They hit it off immediately, and Sarah was grateful to have found such a great roommate. However, little did she know, her life was about to take a terrifying turn. As Sarah settled into her new life, strange things began happening in the apartment. It started with small, inconsequential things: missing items, strange noises at night, and cold spots in the apartment. At first, Sarah brushed it off as her imagination, but as the occurrences became more frequent and unsettling, she couldn't ignore them any longer. Sarah tried to rationalize the strange happenings, attributing them to old pipes or creaky floorboards. But deep down, she knew there was something more sinister at play. Her suspicions were confirmed when she began hearing whispers at night and seeing shadows move on their own. Terrified, Sarah confided in her neighbors, who were quick to share the apartment's dark history. They told her about the previous tenants who had left abruptly, citing strange happenings and a heavy, unsettling presence in the apartment. The more Sarah learned, the more she realized that something was terribly wrong with her new home. The first few weeks in the apartment were relatively uneventful. Sarah and Rebecca quickly fell into a comfortable routine. Sarah worked long hours at her new job, and Rebecca was a graduate student, often engrossed in her studies. They shared meals occasionally, watched TV together, and even went out for drinks a few times. Everything seemed normal, almost idyllic, until the strange occurrences started to escalate. It began with small, easily dismissible events. Sarah would come home to find lights left on that she was certain she had turned off. She'd hear a soft tapping sound in the middle of the night, but when she investigated, she found nothing out of the ordinary. Items seemed to move on their own. Keys were never where she left them, and her favorite coffee mug would mysteriously relocate to different parts of the kitchen. At first, Sarah thought she was simply forgetful or overly tired from work. However, as the weeks went by, the disturbances grew more frequent and unsettling. One night, Sarah awoke to the sound of someone whispering her name. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen, but the whispering had stopped. She brushed it off as a dream, but the next morning, she found the word "leave" scratched into the wooden surface of her nightstand. Sarah confronted Rebecca about the strange occurrences, but Rebecca seemed genuinely confused and concerned. She suggested that the building's age might be the cause of the odd noises and offered to help Sarah look for logical explanations. Together, they checked the apartment for drafts, faulty wiring, and anything else that could explain the strange happenings, but they found nothing. As days turned into weeks, Sarah's unease grew. She started to feel a constant chill in certain areas of the apartment, particularly in her bedroom and the hallway. The tapping sound became more persistent, often waking her in the middle of the night. The whispers, too, became more frequent and harder to dismiss as mere dreams. Sarah's sleep was plagued by nightmares, and she began to dread returning to the apartment each evening. One evening, Sarah ran into Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment directly below hers. Mrs. Jenkins was known for her fondness for gossip and her extensive knowledge of the building's history. Desperate for answers, Sarah decided to ask her if she knew anything about the apartment's past. "Oh dear," Mrs. Jenkins said, her face paling as soon as Sarah mentioned her apartment number. "You're living in the old Hargrove place. That apartment has quite the history. You see, years ago, a young woman named Emily Hargrove lived there. She was a recluse, rarely seen outside of the apartment. One day, she just vanished without a trace. The police searched everywhere, but they never found her body. After she disappeared, strange things started happening in that apartment. Every tenant since then has experienced things." Mrs. Jenkins' words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She had to know more. "What kind of things?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, cold spots, just like you described. Some people say it's Emily's spirit, restless and trapped. Others believe something more sinister is at play." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes bore into Sarah's, filled with a mix of fear and pity. "I don't mean to frighten you, but you should be careful, dear." Sarah thanked Mrs. Jenkins and hurried back to her apartment, her mind racing. The idea of a haunted apartment seemed absurd, but the more she thought about it, the more everything seemed to fit. That night, she lay in bed wide awake, every creak and groan of the building amplifying her growing terror. The next morning, Sarah noticed Rebecca acting strangely. She was more withdrawn, her eyes darkened with fatigue. Sarah asked if everything was all right, but Rebecca dismissed her concerns with a forced smile and a wave of her hand. "Just stress from school," she said. But Sarah wasn't convinced. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Sarah decided to dig deeper into the apartment's history. She visited the local library, searching through old newspapers and records. She found articles about Emily Hargrove's disappearance, but there were no concrete answers. What struck Sarah most were the accounts from previous tenants, all describing similar experiences to hers. One particularly disturbing article mentioned a former tenant who claimed to have seen Emily's ghost. The tenant described Emily as a young woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes, wearing a white nightgown. The tenant's account ended with a chilling statement. "She warned me to leave, but I didn't listen. I should have listened." Armed with this new information, Sarah returned to the apartment with a sense of dread. She shared her findings with Rebecca, who listened intently but offered no new insights. Instead, Rebecca suggested they try to communicate with the spirit to understand what it wanted. Sarah was hesitant but agreed, hoping it might bring some resolution. That night, they set up a makeshift seance in the living room. They lit candles and placed them in a circle, sitting in the center with their hands joined. Rebecca began to speak, calling out to Emily, asking for a sign. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Maybe it was all just in their heads. But then, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the candles flickered violently. A cold, oppressive presence filled the air, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. It wasn't just her name this time. It was a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, telling her to leave, to run, to get out while she still could. In the dim light, Sarah saw Rebecca's eyes widen with terror. They both felt it, the unmistakable sense that they were not alone, that something malevolent was watching them. The seance abruptly ended as one of the candles toppled over, plunging the room into darkness. Rebecca grabbed Sarah's hand and they fled to Sarah's bedroom, slamming the door behind them. They sat on the bed, trembling and holding each other for comfort. "What have we done?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Rebecca shook her head, her expression one of utter fear. "I don't know, but we need to find a way to stop it. Whatever it is, it's getting stronger. And it's angry." As they huddled together in the darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had just made a terrible mistake. The spirit was no longer content with subtle warnings. It wanted them out, and it was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. The true horror of their situation began to sink in, and Sarah realized that their only chance of survival was to uncover the full truth about Emily Hargrove and find a way to lay her spirit to rest. The days following the seance were a waking nightmare for Sarah. The once cozy apartment now felt like a menacing prison. The paranormal activities escalated rapidly, leaving Sarah and Rebecca in a state of constant fear. The whispers became louder and more persistent, the cold spots more pronounced. Objects flew off shelves, doors slammed shut on their own, and the tapping noise grew into a relentless pounding that echoed through the apartment at all hours. Sarah's sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares in which she saw a young woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. Emily Hargrove, she was certain, reaching out to her, begging for help, then transforming into a grotesque, snarling figure that attacked her. Each morning, she woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, and a sense of dread settling deeper into her bones. Rebecca's behavior became increasingly erratic. She was often found staring blankly at the walls, muttering to herself in a language Sarah couldn't understand. Her once bright and lively eyes were now dull and hollow, dark circles forming under them from lack of sleep. When Sarah tried to talk to her, Rebecca would either snap angrily or dissolve into tears, apologizing for reasons she couldn't articulate. Desperate for answers, Sarah took a day off work to research more about Emily Hargrove and the history of their apartment. She revisited the library, digging through old records and newspaper archives. One particular article caught her eye. It detailed the mysterious circumstances of Emily's disappearance. According to the report, Emily had been a bright, young woman studying the occult. She had conducted numerous rituals and experiments in an attempt to contact the spirit world. Neighbors reported hearing strange chants and seeing eerie lights from her apartment late at night. One chilling detail stood out. Emily had been last seen performing a ritual to summon a spirit she believed could grant her immense power. The ritual, as described in her diary, was intended to open a doorway to the other side. It was this doorway that Sarah now believed was the source of the apartment's haunting. Armed with this new information, Sarah returned home with a growing sense of urgency. She needed to find Emily's diary to understand the ritual fully and, hopefully, find a way to reverse it. She shared her findings with Rebecca, who seemed to have moments of clarity amidst her descent into madness. "We need to find the diary," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's the only way we'll know what we're dealing with and how to stop it." Rebecca nodded, her eyes momentarily lucid. "It's in the hidden room. I found it months ago but didn't understand its significance. Now I realize I should have told you earlier." The hidden room was a small, almost claustrophobic space accessible through a concealed door behind a large bookshelf in Rebecca's room. When they entered, Sarah felt a cold wave of energy wash over her. The room was filled with old photographs, strange symbols drawn on the walls, and an assortment of unsettling artifacts. Candles, crystals, and what appeared to be animal bones. In the center of the room, on an old wooden desk, lay a leather-bound diary. Sarah opened it and began to read. Emily's entries were a disturbing mix of scientific observations and increasingly unhinged rants about the spirits she was contacting. The final entries detailed the ritual she had performed, complete with diagrams and incantations. As Sarah read aloud, Rebecca's condition seemed to worsen. She clutched her head, groaning in pain, as if the words were affecting her physically. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's too powerful now." Undeterred, Sarah continued reading until she found what she was looking for: a reversal ritual. It was complex and dangerous, requiring precise steps and rare ingredients. But it was their only hope. That night, Sarah and Rebecca prepared for the reversal ritual. They gathered the necessary items: salt, candles, a silver knife, and an amulet Sarah had found in the hidden room. As they set up in the living room, the apartment felt more oppressive than ever. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe, and the shadows seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. Sarah began the ritual, chanting the incantations from the diary while Rebecca assisted. As the ritual progressed, the room grew colder, and the whispers became deafening. The spirit of Emily appeared, a ghostly figure hovering in the corner, her hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. She screamed, a sound that pierced through Sarah's very soul, but Sarah held her ground, continuing the chant. Suddenly, the apartment was plunged into darkness. The candles flickered and went out, leaving them in complete blackness. Sarah felt a crushing weight on her chest, as if the spirit was trying to suffocate her. She fought to breathe, to continue the ritual, but the pressure was overwhelming. In the darkness, Rebecca screamed, her voice filled with agony. Sarah fumbled for the amulet, her fingers trembling, and placed it on the floor as the diary instructed. She drew the silver knife and made a small cut on her palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the amulet. Instantly, the room exploded with light. The shadows recoiled, and the spirit of Emily let out an unearthly wail. The pressure on Sarah's chest lifted, and she gasped for air, feeling a surge of energy coursing through her. She continued the chant, her voice growing stronger as the spirit weakened. Finally, with a blinding flash, the spirit of Emily disappeared, leaving the room in an eerie silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the apartment felt strangely calm. Sarah and Rebecca collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. They had done it, they had banished the spirit. But as they caught their breath, Sarah noticed something alarming. Rebecca's eyes were glazed over, and her body was cold to the touch. She wasn't breathing. Panic surged through Sarah as she tried to revive her roommate, but it was too late. The ritual had taken its toll, and Rebecca had paid the ultimate price. Sarah cradled Rebecca's lifeless body, tears streaming down her face. She had succeeded in banishing the spirit, but at a devastating cost. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She was alone in the apartment, and the haunting may have ended, but the horror was far from over.